Good evening. Well, I spent many hours in Parliament yesterday. I gave my maiden speech, and I was in today, of course, for the first Prime Minister's questions, the big, great piece of theatre that is, I mean, really, let's be honest about it, quite a global sensation. What have I noticed so far in the Parliament? Well, I have to tell you, I reckon it is between 85 and 90% Remainers. I reckon it's over 50% rejoiners. I mean, they would literally rejoin the European Union tomorrow. And if you even mention or dare to mention legal or illegal immigration, they look at you, they raise their eyes as if you're spoiling a really rather convivial dinner party. So I don't actually think our electoral system, our first-past-the-post system, is giving us really an especially balanced parliament that represents the views of the country. That's me. But then again, you know, any parliament that I'm in, I'm always in a tiny minority in the chamber. But what's also been really interesting, right from Monday when Keir Starmer gave a long speech, he talked about the NATO summit, the European political community. What has been clear from Rishi Sunak, what has been clear from many, many Conservative MPs getting up and speaking, is that they all seem to agree on anything. It appears to be a bit of a uni-party. Let's have a look at Rishi Sunak speaking at the dispatch box in PMQs today.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad in our exchanges so far we have maintained a cross-party consensus on important matters of foreign policy. I'm glad to hear the Prime Minister raise the NATO summit as well, because I very much welcome the message that came out loud and clear from that summit, and indeed the Prime Minister's words from the dispatch box on Monday about Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO membership. I know firsthand how important it is that our Prime Minister can use his prerogative power to quickly respond militarily to protect British national security, sometimes without giving this House prior notice. Now, these are perhaps the most difficult decisions that a Prime Minister can take, and I welcomed his support when I made them. And I want to take this opportunity to assure him of the opposition's support if he deems it necessary to take similar action in the future.
And that's the tone. Everyone agrees on pretty much everything. And, you know, there was a Bob Blackman, who's a Conservative member of Parliament for Harrow East. He was speaking yesterday, and I was tempted to shout out, you're on the wrong side of the house, mate. You should be across with the Labour Party. I literally can't tell them apart. Is there an opposition? I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Farage at GBNews. Now, I raised this point. OK, the Conservatives have taken a terrible beating. Maybe there's an argument for just a little bit of humility from them. But I think it's important for democracy to work, especially when you have a Labour government with a huge majority. I think an opposition voice that asks serious questions is actually an essential part of that process. I'm joined this evening by two friends of the programme, Richard Drax, former Conservative Member of Parliament, and Stella, Tsantekidou, former Labour advisor and political commentator. And I think I pronounced your name right.
You pronounced it wonderfully, like a true European.
Oh, here we go. Well, talking of that, it appears we're fast-tracking back into all sorts of agreements with the European Union. I mean, Starmer promised we wouldn't actually rejoin the institutions of the European Union, but it seems to me this is a very pro-EU government.
I would say it's quite the opposite. I read a statement by Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, today, in which he said that as part of the growth mission board that Rachel Reeves is leading, they're going to make it easier to scrap EU law so that we can go ahead with building more infrastructure and more housing. So I would say they are making true the intention of Boris Johnson, which was to, you know, give this country some growth and get rid of any kind of regulation that is not serving us.
Well, a different point of view. I hope you're right, by the way, because the Conservatives got rid of virtually no EU rules at all. Richard Drax, I say former Conservative MP, you were one of 251 that didn't make it back.
That's right, yes.
I mean, how do you look at the Conservative Party? I mean, are they going to provide any opposition, or are they just so hopelessly split that they can't?
Well, the key word, Nigel, is opposition, isn't it? And today we didn't really see that. And I quite understand it's the first session, and the ex-Prime Minister is probably feeling a bit sore. The party's feeling a bit humbled, I'm sure, and so it was meant to be, you know, a bit consensual today. But when we know that the Labour Party, with this massive majority, and all the things that are coming down the road that they haven't told us are coming, but we know are, not least tax rises,
taxes, pensions,
and a closer move to the EU, I would have thought it's now the time to start digging into what their policies are, which the press, in my view, failed to do over that 6-week election campaign.
Yeah, there wasn't much scrutiny. And Stella, the interesting thing is, I mean, obviously, Starmer's in a very, very good mood. The Labour benches are all joyous. They've secured this huge victory, and yet only 33.8% of the vote. A third of the vote and 2/3 of the seat. And I raise this because the last Labour conference voted for electoral reform. Do you think that's now off the agenda?
Well, proportional representation, electoral reform there has been a referendum in this country which was rejected. So this has already been considered by the electorate. What I would say about the percentage that Keir Starmer got is that people would have voted tactically because they are aware of the first past the post system. So a British voter knows when they're going to the ballot box that if there is a competition between a Lib Dem and a Conservative, even if I want a Labour government, for me to get a Labour government, I have to vote for the Lib Dem so that we get the Tories out. I'm really sorry, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, but what an awful system. that we're not really voting for who we believe in. We're voting tactically, we're voting cynically, we're voting for who we hate least.
I mean, how many people do you know who are so involved in politics where they say, I mean, that would be a bit unhealthy, where they say, I love this politician is my hero. It's usually posthumously that we look at Clement Attlee and whoever else and we think,
Maybe.
They were a really good reform politician.
But to vote positively, I think electoral reform would give us that. Do you think this government is going to have any honeymoon at all? And I say that because the economic figures, the borrowing figures that we've seen for the last month are bad, to say the very least. I look at the front bench. There are clearly some people there with experience, but a lot of them may well be out of their depth. Blair in 97 had this amazing 6 to 9 month period when no one challenged anything he said. This is going to be tough, isn't it?
The situation in the country was definitely better for sure, and we see that from all of the statistics that have been presented this week. The Office of the National Audit Office and several departments have released some very, very worrying statistics about the state of the infrastructure and our roads, the state of the NHS and the underinvestment that has been going on there.
You say underinvestment.
Crime up 40% compared to 12 months ago.
But Stella, we've spent more and more money on the NHS.
Correct.
We've gone from just a few years ago, 7.5% of GDP on the NHS to over 11% on the NHS.
Yeah.
It's not underfunding that's the problem.
Yes, absolutely. I think what happened with the NHS is that you have an increasingly older population, and rather than you spend all of that money on the day-to-day costs, so you're not really spending on the infrastructure, so that's a big problem. The Labour Party recognizes that Wes Streeting, the health secretary, has said, we are going to spend money on getting new machines, which we desperately need, but at the same time, we're going to reform the NHS so that it is not a black hole of cash.
Stella, I really hope he does. It won't be easy, but I hope he does.
Yeah, I hope he does too. I mean, less bureaucrats. That's the key. There's layer upon layer upon layer, and I've heard it during my 14 years as an MP from the local NHS, and they all say the huge levels of bureaucracy have increased. Diversity people on £50,000, £60,000 a year. I mean, why do you need someone like that? A good manager should be able to cope with that sort of issue. Money back to clinicians in the front line and less than the bureaucrats.
Yeah, I'm sure that sentiment's shared by the public. Yeah. Let's see Wes Streeting at least is prepared to think outside the box on this. Good. So we wish him well, genuinely. Richard, back to the main question.
Yeah.
You know, is there an opposition? It doesn't feel like there is one at the moment. I guess a lot depends on who the next Conservative leader is.
It does.
And how do you see that contest?
I don't want to make predictions or comment about my former colleagues because they're friends, and that would be wrong of me to do so. Personally, I would have thought a period of calm would be no bad thing. If I were back in the House, I would suggest that Ian Duncan-Smith, for example, whose integrity is unquestioned, I'm not saying that the others are, but he is a former leader, should be appointed as an interim leader for about a year or so, while these new others have a chance to sell themselves and then be chosen.
That argument was made, but as it is, they've made a decision.
November the 2nd, isn't it?
November the 2nd.
Yeah.
And Sunak will stay on till then.
Yeah.
Is this going to be a battle between the Eurosceptic right and the One Nationers? Is it as simple as that?
The Conservative Party has one single job to do, in my very humble opinion, and that's to be conservative and to go back to its core philosophy. which since I got in 2010, I've seen the party drift away from, starting with David Cameron, and then it just went away. So to go back to our core philosophy, which is the simplest of all the political philosophies, ours, get back to that, and we will start to win again. If we start claiming don't go too far right or too far left, or let's try and find the centre, these places don't exist. Either you have a philosophy and you believe in it, or you don't.
Final thought on not so much opposition, but Keir Starmer. 7 people last night rebelled on the 2-child limit for child benefit. Boom, they've had the whip removed. I mean, was that necessary?
Well, as Jacob Rees-Mogg was explaining at the State of the Nation last night, this is a constitutional vote. This is a constitutionally important vote, especially after an election. This is a vote not just on an amendment from the opposition, but a vote of confidence in the government.
On their manifesto.
Exactly, on a manifesto, on something that was in the manifesto. So these 7 MPs, there were other MPs like Diane Abbott, for example, who did not vote on this amendment, even though you will not find a person in the Labour Party who is in favour of the 2-child benefit cap. You will not find an MP who is in favour of it.
Yet.
So these people were trying to make a statement, and I completely accept that. You get to do that, but then at the same time, you can see how the leader gets to do that early on to show to the rest of the MPs, especially the new MPs, to understand what it's going to be like.
So is Keir Starmer a bit tougher than he looks?
We already knew that. He's tough enough.
Well, I have to say, he did kick out some of the hard left, and I've, over the last couple of years on this programme, said you have to give him credit for getting rid of the Corbyns and some of those people. We'll see. He's facing an almighty test. And for the sake of the country, I guess we do wish him well. But we do need a parliament that challenges a Labour Party with a huge majority. I think a fair bit will depend on who the next Conservative leader is, but that's many, many months away. But I can assure you, our little gang of 5 will be making plenty of noise over the course of the next few days.